I found out my own father didn't invite me to Thanksgiving the same way you find out a stranger unfollowed you online. By accident. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table in my grandmother's house, scrolling through my phone while the smell of roasted turkey drifted faintly through the neighborhood. Maplewood Drive was full of life that evening. Cars lined the curbs. Laughter echoed from open windows. Somewhere down the street, a group of kids was throwing a football in the fading light. Then I saw the photo. My cousin Rachel had posted it 20 minutes earlier. The caption read, "Family Thanksgiving. Everyone who matters." The picture showed my father standing at the head of his dining table, carving a turkey like he did every year. My brother Dylan was beside him holding a plate. My aunts and cousins crowded around the table, smiling at the camera. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar wave of anger or embarrassment to hit me. But what came instead was something quieter. Confusion. Because a week earlier, my father had told me Thanksgiving dinner probably wasn't happening this year. He said everyone had been too busy. That the family was keeping things simple. Apparently simple meant leaving me out entirely. I locked my phone and set it on the table. The silence of the house pressed in around me. The place I was sitting in wasn't just any house. It was the house my grandmother Margaret had left to me 6 months earlier. 2 stories of old red brick. Tall maple trees framing the driveway. Creaky hardwood floors that always seemed to whisper when someone walked across them. The house had been in our family longer than I had been alive. My grandmother used to say the walls carried the memory of every Thanksgiving dinner ever served inside them. Ironically, this was the first Thanksgiving I had ever spent here alone. The dining room table in front of me still wore the faded linen tablecloth my grandmother used every year. I had never had the heart to fold it away. The chairs around the table sat empty, pushed in neatly like guests who had quietly slipped out the door. I reached for my glass of wine and took a slow sip. No one from my family had called all day. Not my father. Not my brother. Not even one of my aunts asking if I planned to stop by later. The silence felt intentional. 6 months earlier, when my grandmother's will was read downtown, I thought the tension that followed was temporary. Families get strange around inheritances. People say things they don't mean. I believed time would smooth everything out. But that belief started cracking the moment my father began making comments about the house. "You've been through a lot this year, Natalie," he said one evening over the phone. "After the divorce and everything, maybe maintaining a place like that is more responsibility than you need right now." At the time, I thought he was just worried about me. Now the words sounded different in my head. 3 days ago, he left me a voicemail that had been echoing in my thoughts ever since. His voice sounded strangely formal. "Call me back when you can," he said. "We should talk about what you're planning to do with the property." The property. Not the house. Not Grandma's place. The property. I walked over to the front window and looked out toward the quiet street. Most of my neighbors were inside finishing dinner, their windows glowing warm with yellow light. The air smelled like turkey, cinnamon, and wood smoke. A dark SUV rolled slowly past the house. I barely noticed it at first. Cars passed through Maplewood sometimes, especially during holidays when relatives were visiting. But this one drove slower than usual. The driver didn't stop. The vehicle just glided past my driveway and continued down the block until it turned the corner. Something about it made me pause. Maybe it was the way the headlights briefly swept across the front of the house. Maybe it was the feeling that someone inside the vehicle had been watching. I stepped away from the window and shook the thought off. I was letting my imagination run too far ahead of me. For months, I had tried to convince myself the tension between my father and me was just temporary. But seeing that Thanksgiving photo earlier had changed something. Being left out wasn't an accident. It was a message. I returned to the table and looked around the quiet room. At that moment, I still believed the worst thing my family could do was leave me out of dinner. I had no idea that before the night was over, they would be standing at my front door with a lawyer, trying to take the house my grandmother trusted me with. The house had always been the center of our family. I walked slowly through the hallway, letting my hand brush against the old wooden railing that curved up the staircase. The wood was smooth from decades of use. My grandmother used to polish it every Sunday morning while humming songs from the 70s. She believed houses could remember things. Walls listen, she used to say with a quiet smile. They remember who loved each other and who didn't. Standing there on Thanksgiving night, I wondered what the walls of this place remembered about my family. Because 6 months earlier, everything had changed inside this house the moment my grandmother's will was read. We were all sitting in a small law office downtown that morning. My father had insisted the whole family attend. My brother Dylan leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone while my aunt whispered something to one of my cousins. The air in the room carried the polite tension people bring into places where money might be discussed. I remember feeling strangely calm. My grandmother Margaret had lived a long life. None of us were surprised she had prepared a will. She had always been organized like that. I assumed the house would remain part of the shared family estate. That was how things usually worked. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading the document line by line. At first, everything sounded ordinary. Personal items went to different relatives. Jewelry to my aunt. Some savings accounts divided between the grandchildren. Then he reached the section about the house. I can still hear the exact sentence. The property located at Maplewood Drive is to be transferred in full to my granddaughter, Natalie Brooks. For a second, the room went completely silent. Not the polite silence people use during serious moments. The kind that arrives when everyone suddenly realizes something unexpected just happened. My father's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "Are you certain that's the most recent version of the will?" he asked the lawyer. His voice sounded controlled. But there was something tight underneath it. The lawyer nodded calmly. "Yes. Your mother updated the document 2 months before she passed away." I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. The truth was, I hadn't asked for the house. I loved the place. Of course, I had spent most of my childhood here. But I never imagined my grandmother would leave it entirely to me. After the meeting ended, we stepped outside into the parking lot. The sun felt too bright after the quiet tension of the office. I didn't know she was planning that. I told my father and Dylan quickly. I thought the house would stay with everyone. My father studied me in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Your grandmother was emotional near the end," he said quietly. "People make unusual decisions when they're not thinking clearly." At the time, I didn't know what to say. I told myself he was grieving. Now, standing inside the house months later, those words echoed differently in my mind. That same afternoon, just as I was about to leave the lawyer's office, the attorney asked if I could stay behind for a moment. The rest of my family walked out ahead of me. The lawyer closed the office door and lowered his voice slightly. "Your grandmother was very clear about this decision," he said. "She insisted the house go to you specifically." I remember asking him why. He hesitated before answering. "She believed you would protect it." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But now those words felt heavier. I wandered into the living room and looked at the armchair near the window. My grandmother used to sit there every afternoon with a book balanced on her lap and a cup of tea resting on the small table beside her. Thanksgiving dinners used to fill this room with noise. My cousins arguing over football games on television. My father telling stories about the neighborhood from when he was a kid. My grandmother laughing louder than anyone else whenever someone spilled something on the tablecloth. Now the house was quiet. Too quiet. I walked into the kitchen and opened one of the drawers. Searching for the bottle opener I usually kept there. The drawer stuck halfway open the way it always had. As I shifted the utensils aside, something caught my eye. An envelope. The paper looked older than the rest of the items in the drawer, slightly yellowed at the edges. I was certain it hadn't been there when I moved into the house. I picked it up slowly. My grandmother's handwriting stretched across the front in careful, slightly shaky letters. For Natalie only. My chest tightened as I turned the envelope over in my hands. Grandma had always been the kind of person who hid little surprises around the house, notes inside cookbooks, old photographs tucked behind picture frames. But something about this felt different. More deliberate. I slid a finger under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside were 2 things. The first was a folded handwritten letter. The second was a photocopied document covered in zoning numbers and property markings I didn't immediately recognize. I unfolded the letter first. My grandmother's handwriting filled the page. The first line stopped me cold. If you are reading this, Natalie, it means something has already begun happening in the family. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The house felt even quieter than before. I kept reading. Your father has been asking questions about the house for months. Questions that made me uncomfortable. My breath caught as my eyes moved down the page. That was when I reached the sentence that made my heart start pounding. I changed the will because I did not trust what your father was planning. For a long moment, I just stared at those words. My grandmother had never spoken badly about anyone in our family. Never. And yet here it was in her own handwriting. I looked down at the second paper inside the envelope. It was a land assessment document connected to Maplewood Drive. Highlighted sections mentioned development interest in the neighborhood. Suddenly something clicked in my mind. Over the past year, several houses on nearby streets had quietly been sold. New survey markers had appeared along empty lots. Neighbors mentioned developers buying property piece by piece. I remembered Dylan stopping by the house a few weeks earlier. He had wandered around the backyard for almost 20 minutes. At the time, he said he was just checking the fence. But now I wasn't so sure. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back inside the envelope. A strange uneasiness settled into my chest. Maybe being excluded from Thanksgiving dinner wasn't about family tension at all. Maybe it was about something else. I walked toward the front window and glanced out at the street. At that exact moment, the same dark SUV from earlier rolled slowly past the house again. This time it slowed even more as it reached my driveway. I watched carefully as it continued down the street. A cold feeling crept up my spine. Something wasn't right. I was still standing there staring through the glass when I heard it. The sound of tires crunching slowly on the gravel of my driveway. Someone had just pulled up to the house. Gravel crunched slowly outside my window. I froze where I stood in the kitchen. The envelope still in my hand. The sound was unmistakable. Tires rolling carefully up the short driveway beside the house. For a second, I wondered if it might be a neighbor turning around. But the engine didn't keep moving. It stopped. I walked toward the front window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. A black sedan had parked near the front steps. Behind it sat the same dark SUV I had seen driving past the house earlier. 3 people stepped out of the sedan. My father, my brother Dylan, and a man I had never seen before carrying a leather briefcase. Even from the window I could tell what he was. A lawyer. A strange calm settled over me. For months I had felt something building inside this family. Conversations that ended too quickly. Questions about the house that sounded harmless but never really were. Now whatever this was had finally arrived at my front door. My father knocked 3 times. The sound echoed through the quiet hallway. For a moment I considered pretending I wasn't home. But the light in the living room was on. And my car was parked in the driveway. Besides, something inside me wanted to see exactly what they had come for. I opened the door. My father stepped forward immediately as if the house still belonged to him. "Natalie," he said, his voice warm in the way it always became when he wanted something. Dylan stood a few feet behind him with his hands in his jacket pockets. The man with the briefcase gave a polite nod. "This is Thomas Caldwell," my father said. "He's helping us sort out a small family matter." A small family matter. I stepped aside and let them enter. Cold evening air followed them into the house before the door closed again. The 3 of them moved into the dining room where the table still held the faded Thanksgiving tablecloth my grandmother used every year. My father glanced around the room briefly. "It's good to see the place being taken care of," he said. I folded my arms. "You didn't come here to admire the furniture." For a moment no one spoke. Then the lawyer set his briefcase on the table and opened it. My father clasped his hands together like a man preparing to deliver important news. "We've been talking about the house," he said. "Your brother and I? We think it might be time to make a decision about how it's handled." I looked at Dylan. He kept his eyes on the floor. "What kind of decision?" I asked. My father smiled patiently. "Natalie, you've been through a difficult year. The divorce, the move, everything that comes with starting over. Managing a property like this can be overwhelming." The words sounded exactly like the ones he had been repeating for months. Concern disguised as advice. The lawyer removed a folder from his briefcase and placed it carefully on the table. Inside were several sheets of printed legal documents. I recognized the formatting immediately. Property transfer forms. The lawyer slid the papers toward me. "If you sign here," he said calmly, "the ownership of the house will be transferred to your brother Dylan. The property would remain in the family. And you would still be welcome to live here as long as you'd like." My father nodded as if the explanation had already settled everything. "It's the simplest solution," he said. "Dylan has more experience managing financial matters. This way the house stays protected." Protected. I stared down at the papers without touching them. "So that's why I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving?" I asked quietly. My father frowned. "That's not what this is about." "Really?" I said. "Because it feels a lot like an ambush." Dylan shifted slightly beside the wall. For a moment our eyes met. Then he looked away again. The silence in the room thickened. My father pushed the papers a little closer across the table. "You don't need to make this complicated," he said. "Just sign it and we can all move forward as a family." His voice carried a softness that almost sounded reasonable. But underneath it I heard something else. Impatience. Pressure. I glanced down at the documents again. My name was already typed beside the signature line. They hadn't come here to discuss anything. They had come expecting me to panic, expecting me to fold. I slowly lifted my eyes back to my father. "If this is about the house," I said, "then maybe you should explain why you're in such a hurry to take it." For the first time since arriving, he hesitated. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Dylan shifted his weight from one foot to the other. That hesitation told me everything. Because suddenly I understood something my grandmother had been trying to warn me about. This wasn't about family responsibility. It was about something they didn't want me to see. My father's patience finally thinned. He tapped the signature line with his finger. "Just sign it." "Natalie," he said quietly, "this is what's best for the family." I looked at the paper. Then I looked back up at him. And in that moment, something became very clear. They thought they had caught me alone tonight. They thought the pressure would make me panic. What they didn't know yet was that I had already started asking questions. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I pushed the document slowly back across the table until it stopped in front of my father. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet in the room felt different now, sharper, heavier. My father stared at the papers as if they had suddenly become more complicated than he expected. Then he looked back up at me. "You didn't even read it," he said. "I don't need to," I replied. Across the table, the lawyer shifted slightly in his chair. Dylan still hadn't moved from his place near the doorway. I leaned back in my seat and folded my hands together. "Is this about the developer deal?" I asked. The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. My father's expression changed instantly. It was small, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know him well. But I had spent my entire life watching his face during arguments, negotiations, family gatherings where tension simmered under polite conversation. For the first time since walking into the house, he looked surprised. The lawyer glanced quickly toward him. Dylan straightened against the wall. "What developer deal?" my father said. His voice sounded calm. But the question came too quickly. I reached across the table and slid the photocopied paper from my grandmother's envelope into the center of the table. The document showed zoning markings and property lines for several streets around Maplewood Drive. The moment my father saw it, his eyes flickered. He recognized it. "You found that in the house?" he asked. "In an envelope Grandma left for me," I said. The lawyer leaned forward and scanned the paper carefully. I watched the three of them instead of the document. My father was no longer smiling. Dylan rubbed the back of his neck like someone who had just realized the conversation had taken a wrong turn. "Developers have been buying houses around here," I continued calmly. "Everyone in the neighborhood knows it. Several lots down the street were sold last year." My father waved a hand dismissively. "Rumors," he said. "People always exaggerate those things." But his voice didn't carry the confidence it had earlier. I rested my elbows lightly on the table. Then why did Dylan spend 20 minutes walking around the backyard last month? I asked. Dylan looked up sharply. You said you were checking the fence. I continued. But you kept looking at the property lines. My brother didn't answer. His silence filled the room louder than anything else. My father's eyes moved slowly between us. That's not relevant, he said. It feels relevant, I replied. I leaned back again and studied both of them. For months, the pieces of this situation had felt scattered in my head. Conversations that didn't quite make sense. Questions that sounded casual but carried a strange urgency. Now the pieces were starting to fit. If Dylan owns the house, I said slowly, he can sell it. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. And if the land around here really is valuable, I continued, then selling this property would bring in a lot of money. I turned my attention directly to my brother. How much debt are you in? The question hung in the air. Dylan looked at our father before answering. My father immediately stepped forward. That's none of your business, he snapped. But Dylan's expression told me everything I needed to know. I exhaled slowly. So that's it, I said. My father shook his head. You're making assumptions. No, I replied quietly. I'm finally connecting the dots. The lawyer cleared his throat. I think we should focus on the paperwork in front of us, he said carefully. But even he sounded less certain than before. My father moved closer to the table. The house is valuable, he said bluntly. And keeping it tied up under one person isn't smart. There it is, I said. His voice sharpened. Selling it could help everyone in this family. Or just Dylan, I replied. Dylan looked like he wanted to disappear into the wall. My father's patience cracked. You're being selfish, he said. This property could solve a lot of problems. Selfish. The word didn't sting the way it used to. Growing up, that word had always been his favorite weapon whenever I disagreed with him. But tonight it sounded hollow. I glanced toward the envelope from my grandmother resting on the corner of the table. She had known something like this might happen. That realization gave me a strange kind of strength. My father pushed the documents closer again. We're not here to argue all night, he said sharply. Sign the papers and we can move forward. I didn't move. Across the table, the lawyer began quietly gathering a few loose pages as if he sensed the situation slipping out of control. Then I said the one thing that finally made the room go completely silent. If you were hoping to scare me into signing tonight, I said calmly, you should probably know something first. My father narrowed his eyes. What's that? I folded my hands together and met his gaze. I'm not the only lawyer involved in this conversation. No one spoke. Dylan looked up. The lawyer stopped moving. And my father's expression changed in a way I had never seen before. For the first time since he walked into the house, he didn't look certain anymore. My father stared at me as if trying to decide whether I was bluffing. What lawyer? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. The sound of the glass touching the table echoed faintly in the quiet dining room. Across from me, the lawyer Thomas Caldwell shifted slightly in his chair. Dylan looked between the two of us like someone caught in the middle of a storm he didn't expect to walk into. Finally, I set the glass down. A real estate attorney in Columbus, I said calmly. Marcus Hale. The name seemed to settle in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I continued before my father could interrupt. A few weeks ago, I started noticing something strange, I said. The comments about the house. The questions about what I planned to do with the property. Dylan wandering around the backyard like he was inspecting the land. Dylan shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. So I called someone who actually understands property law, I said. My father's jaw tightened. And what exactly did this lawyer tell you? He asked. I leaned forward slightly. He told me something very simple. I said, the house belongs to me. The lawyer Caldwell cleared his throat. That is technically correct, he admitted carefully. My father turned toward him sharply. But the transfer agreement only works if she signs voluntarily. Caldwell interrupted. The words hung in the air. Without her signature, he added quietly. The document has no legal force. My father's expression darkened. For the first time since arriving, the confident rhythm of his plan had begun to crack. He shifted tactics immediately. "You're misunderstanding the situation," he said to me. "No one is forcing you to do anything." His voice had returned to that familiar calm tone he used when trying to regain control. "We're trying to help you," he continued. "Managing property like this can become complicated. Taxes, repairs, legal responsibilities." I didn't interrupt. For most of my life, this was the moment when I would start doubting myself. But tonight, the house around me felt like quiet support. I glanced toward the living room where my grandmother's armchair sat by the window. She had chosen me to protect this place. That thought settled my nerves. I already talked about those responsibilities with Marcus. I said, My father frowned, and he suggested something else. My eyes moved toward the corner of the ceiling. Just above the doorway, a small security camera blinked with a faint red light. My father followed my gaze. His shoulders stiffened. "The entire conversation tonight has been recorded," I said calmly. For a moment, no one moved. Then the lawyer Caldwell sat up straighter. "You installed cameras?" he asked. "A few weeks ago," I replied. The lawyer's face tightened as the legal implications began forming in his mind. My father's expression hardened. "So you set a trap," he said. "No," I answered quietly. "I set boundaries." Dylan finally spoke. His voice sounded tired. "Natalie." He stopped halfway through the sentence. I looked at him. "If you want to say something, Dylan, you should say it." He hesitated, glancing toward our father. Then the words slipped out before he could stop them. "The developer deal is real." The room froze. My father snapped his head toward him. "Enough," he said sharply. "But the damage was done." I leaned back slowly in my chair. "So you already promised the land to someone," I said. Dylan rubbed his forehead. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered. My father slammed his palm lightly against the table. "You're making this worse." But Dylan wasn't looking at him anymore. "They're offering a lot of money," he said quietly. "Dad said if we got control of the house tonight, we could close the deal before the end of the year." Silence filled the room. The lawyer Caldwell closed his briefcase slowly. It was clear he no longer wanted to be part of whatever this situation had become. My father looked at me again. His voice dropped lower. "You're making a mistake," he said. I didn't answer. Instead, I glanced toward my phone lying face down on the table. My father noticed. His eyes narrowed. "Why do you keep looking at that?" he asked. I turned the phone over in my hand. "Because we're expecting someone." The tension in the room tightened instantly. My father's voice sharpened. "Who?" Before I could answer, headlights flashed through the front window. Bright beams swept across the walls of the dining room. A vehicle had just pulled up outside. The engine shut off. I stood from my chair. My father's voice followed me as I walked toward the hallway. "Natalie," he said. "Who did you call?" I paused near the front door. Then I answered without turning around. "My lawyer." I rested my hand on the doorknob. "And the county sheriff." The headlights outside faded as the engine shut off in the driveway. For a moment, no one in the dining room moved. Behind me, I could feel my father staring at my back like he was trying to force the situation back under his control. "You called the sheriff," he said. His voice carried the kind of disbelief that only comes when someone realizes the rules of the situation have changed. I rested my hand on the doorknob but didn't open it yet. "Yes," I said calmly. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "This is a family conversation." I turned halfway toward him. "Family conversations don't usually involve lawyers and property transfer documents," I said. Dylan shifted near the doorway, his face pale. Thomas Caldwell had already closed his briefcase completely. The lawyer now stood beside the table looking like someone who wished he had never stepped into the house. A knock sounded on the door. 3 steady taps. I opened it. Standing on the porch was Marcus Hale. Tall, calm, dressed in a dark overcoat that looked slightly dusted with cold evening air. Beside him stood County Sheriff Daniel Ortiz. his badge catching the porch light. "Evening," the sheriff said. His voice was steady and professional. "Everything all right here?" I stepped aside. "Yes," I said. "But I thought it might be helpful to have witnesses." Marcus nodded politely and walked inside. The sheriff followed him. The moment they entered the dining room, the atmosphere shifted completely. My father straightened his shoulders. "This is unnecessary," he said quickly. "We were just having a private discussion." Marcus placed a folder on the table. "I'm sure that's true," he said calmly. "But my client was concerned she might be pressured into transferring property ownership tonight." Caldwell cleared his throat. "There's no coercion happening here," he said. "We were simply presenting an agreement." Marcus opened the folder and slid a set of documents across the table. "Then you won't mind reviewing the legal details with us," he said. The sheriff leaned casually against the wall near the doorway, watching the room with quiet attention. My father glanced at him, clearly uncomfortable with the uniformed presence. Marcus tapped one of the documents. "This property," he said, "was legally transferred to Natalie Brooks under the final will of Margaret Brooks." His voice remained calm and precise. "There is no shared ownership." Caldwell nodded reluctantly. "That is correct." Marcus continued. "Which means any attempt to pressure Miss Brooks into signing away the property could potentially be considered coercion." The word hung heavily in the air. My father's jaw tightened. "This is absurd," he said. But the confidence had drained from his voice. Marcus looked toward the ceiling. The small security camera blinked quietly above the doorway. "I also understand tonight's conversation has been recorded," he added. Caldwell's eyes followed his gaze. For the first time since arriving, the lawyer looked genuinely alarmed. My father turned toward me. "You planned this," he said. I met his stare. "No," I said quietly. "I prepared for it." Dylan finally spoke again. His voice sounded strained. "Dad, maybe we should just go." My father ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at Marcus. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Marcus remained calm. "I'm simply protecting my client's legal rights." The sheriff shifted slightly beside the wall. "If anyone here feels pressured inside their own home," he said, "I can ask visitors to leave." The room fell silent again. For the first time in my life, my father looked like someone who didn't control the outcome of the conversation. Marcus reached into his folder again. "There's one more detail in the will you should be aware of," he said. My father frowned. "What detail?" Marcus placed a second document on the table. "Margaret Brooks added a clause 2 months before her passing," he explained. The paper slid slowly across the wood. "It states that if any relative attempts to intimidate or pressure Natalie into transferring ownership of the house, that action could weaken any future legal challenge to the inheritance." Dylan stared at the document. "You're saying we can't contest the will?" he asked. "You can," Marcus replied. "But evidence of coercion would significantly damage your case." Everyone in the room glanced toward the small camera again. Caldwell rubbed his forehead. "This conversation is over," he said quietly. My father stood very still. His eyes moved between me, Marcus, and the sheriff. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Marcus asked a simple question. "Mr. Brooks, are you still requesting that your daughter sign over the property tonight?" The silence stretched. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. "We'll discuss this another time," he muttered. Caldwell grabbed the remaining documents and slipped them into his briefcase. The sheriff stepped toward the hallway. "Gentlemen," he said. My father walked toward the door without another word. Dylan followed a few steps behind. At the doorway, he paused. For a moment, he looked at me like he wanted to say something. But whatever it was, he kept it to himself. The front door closed behind them. The quiet returned to the house. I stood there for a moment, feeling the tension slowly drain from my chest. Marcus remained at the table, holding one final document I hadn't seen yet. He glanced toward me. "There's something else your grandmother wanted you to know about this property," he said. I looked at him, and suddenly I realized the night might not be finished yet. The front door closed behind my father and the sound echoed through the house. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Outside, I heard the car doors slam and the low rumble of an engine starting. Headlights swept briefly across the living room window before the vehicles pulled away from the curb. The house fell quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. Lighter. Sheriff Ortiz stepped away from the wall and adjusted his jacket. "Looks like that situation resolved itself," he said. Marcus nodded. "Thank you for coming out tonight. Sheriff." The sheriff gave me a calm look. "If anyone shows up again and causes trouble, you call the office," he said. "You have every right to feel safe in your own home." "I will," I said. He tipped his head politely and walked toward the door. A moment later, the porch light flickered across the floor as he stepped outside. When the door closed again, only Marcus and I remained in the dining room. The house felt strangely peaceful. The same room that had been filled with tension minutes earlier now looked like it always had. Quiet. Familiar. Almost protective. Marcus placed his folder on the table. "You handled that very well," he said. "I was terrified the entire time," I admitted. He smiled slightly. "That's normal." I sat down slowly in one of the dining chairs, feeling the exhaustion of the evening finally catching up with me. The envelope from my grandmother still rested on the table beside the empty place settings. "Marcus noticed it. That the letter you mentioned on the phone?" he asked. I nodded. "She warned me something like tonight might happen." Marcus looked thoughtful. "That doesn't surprise me." He reached into his folder and pulled out a document. "There's something else you should see," he said. I leaned forward. "What is it?" He slid the paper across the table toward me. "This is a copy of the final amendment your grandmother added to the property documents 2 months before she passed away." I glanced down at the page. The language was dense, full of legal phrasing, but one section had been highlighted. "What does it mean?" I asked. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the table. "It means your grandmother anticipated pressure from your family," he said. I looked up at him. "She knew." He nodded. "She didn't say exactly what she suspected, but she was very clear about protecting you." I looked down again at the highlighted paragraph. "If any party attempts to intimidate, coerce, or manipulate the designated heir into transferring ownership of the property." My eyes moved slowly across the rest of the sentence. "Such actions may be presented as evidence in any legal dispute regarding the will." I exhaled quietly. "So tonight actually helps my case." "Very much," Marcus said. He glanced briefly toward the small camera in the corner of the ceiling. "The recording from tonight makes it extremely difficult for anyone to challenge the inheritance successfully. For the first time since my grandmother died, a sense of certainty settled in my chest. She hadn't just trusted me with the house. She had protected me." Marcus gathered the remaining papers and slipped them back into his folder. "Your father likely assumed he could pressure you into signing before you understood the legal situation," he said. "That sounds like him," I replied. Marcus stood. "If anything else happens, call me immediately." "I will." He paused near the doorway. "Your grandmother was a very smart woman," he added. Then he stepped outside. The door closed softly behind him. The house fell completely silent again. I stood there in the middle of the dining room for a long moment, looking around the space. The chairs were still pulled slightly out from the table where everyone had been standing earlier. The tablecloth still held the faint crease from where the transfer documents had rested. But the tension was gone. I walked slowly into the living room. My grandmother's armchair sat near the window exactly where she had always kept it. I rested my hand on the back of it. For years, she had hosted Thanksgiving dinners inside this house. Tonight had started as the loneliest Thanksgiving of my life. But now something else had taken its place. Understanding. She hadn't chosen me because I was the oldest grandchild, or the most successful. She chose me because she believed I would protect what mattered. I returned to the dining room and sat down at the table. The envelope from my grandmother rested beside my plate. I traced my fingers lightly across her handwriting. For the first time that night, I felt calm. Outside, the street had returned to its quiet rhythm. No cars. No voices. just the soft sound of wind moving through the maple trees. The house felt alive again, and for the first time since the will was read 6 months ago, I knew something with absolute certainty. The house was exactly where my grandmother wanted it to be. The house was finally quiet. I stood by the front window for a long moment after Marcus left, watching the last pair of headlights disappear at the end of Maplewood Drive. The street slowly returned to the calm rhythm of a Thanksgiving evening. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed loudly. A car door slammed. A dog barked once and then settled again. Inside the house, the silence felt completely different than it had earlier that night. Before, it had been heavy. Now it felt peaceful. I closed the curtains and walked back into the dining room. The table still looked like the aftermath of a small storm. Chairs pushed slightly out of place. The empty spot where the transfer papers had been sitting. My grandmother's envelope resting quietly beside my plate. For a moment I just stood there, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I sat down in the chair my grandmother used to take every Thanksgiving. The house smelled faintly like old wood and cinnamon. My grandmother used to bake apple pies every holiday morning. The scent of cinnamon had soaked into the kitchen walls over the years. Tonight there was no big dinner. No cousins arguing about football games. No loud stories from my father about the old neighborhood. Just me. And strangely, that didn't feel lonely anymore. I picked up the envelope and turned it slowly in my hands. For Natalie only. Grandma's handwriting had always been neat and careful. Even toward the end of her life when her hands had started to shake. She had known. Not every detail. Maybe. But she had known enough to prepare for something like tonight. I thought about the moment earlier when my father's voice had finally lost its certainty. The moment when the room shifted and he realized he wasn't the one controlling the outcome anymore. For most of my life, he had always been the one with the final word. The one who decided what was best. The one who told everyone else how things were going to work. But tonight had been different. Tonight, the house belonged to me. And more importantly, the decision belonged to me. I set the envelope back down and leaned back in the chair. For months after the will was read, I had wondered if my grandmother made the wrong decision. My father questioned it. My brother avoided talking about it. Even some of my relatives had hinted that maybe the house should belong to the whole family. I had started doubting myself. But tonight answered every question. Grandma hadn't chosen the easiest person in the family. She had chosen the one she believed would stand firm when things got difficult. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator held a few simple things I had bought earlier in the week. Leftover vegetables. A small bakery pie I had picked up that morning, because I thought Thanksgiving might feel strange without at least something traditional. I warmed a plate of food and carried it back to the dining room. Then I lit the small candle my grandmother used to place in the center of the table every year. The soft flame filled the room with warm light. For a second I could almost hear her voice again. She used to say a house wasn't important because of the walls or the roof. It was important because of the choices people made inside it. I sat down at the table and took a quiet bite of food. My phone buzzed softly against the wood beside my plate. A message. Dylan? I hesitated before opening it. The message was short. I didn't know Dad was going to push things that far tonight. I'm sorry. I read it twice. For a long time, my brother and I had just followed our father's lead. Dylan especially. It had always been easier for him to stay on the safe side of the family's expectations. Maybe tonight had been the first time he realized those expectations came with consequences. I set the phone back down without replying. Not because I was angry, but because some things needed time before they could be repaired. The candle flickered gently in front of me. Outside. The night had grown quiet again. I looked around the dining room one more time. The same walls that had watched decades of family dinners had also just witnessed one of the most important moments of my life. Not because I won a fight, but because I finally chose not to surrender something that mattered. I lifted my glass slightly toward the empty chair beside me. Happy Thanksgiving, Grandma, I said softly. The flame of the candle danced in the reflection of the window. For the first time in months, the house felt completely at peace. And so did I. If you've ever had to stand your ground against people who believed they had the right to control your life, then you probably understand exactly what that moment feels like. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't with strangers. They're with family. If you've ever been through something like that, I'd really like to hear your story. Share it down in the comments. Because a lot of people watching may need to know they're not the only ones who've had to set those kinds of boundaries. And if stories about revenge, family drama, hidden truths, and moments where the tables finally turned speak to you, make sure you stay here with the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't hurting someone back. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give away the life that was meant to be yours.